For 60 years, the House of Whitmore has ruled the Kingdom of Alderia with dignity and grace. King Edmund III has been the perfect monarch, wise, beloved, and steadfast. Crown Prince Alexander has been groomed since birth to inherit the throne, carrying himself with the noble bearing expected of future royalty. The royal bloodline has never been questioned. Until now, a single envelope arrives at Whitmore Castle on a stormy October evening. Inside lies evidence that will shatter everything the royal family believes about themselves. DNA test results, hidden for decades, reveal a truth so devastating that it threatens to destroy not just a family, but an entire dynasty. When science collides with centuries of tradition, when a father's love battles a king's duty, and when the very foundation of royal succession crumbles, one question echoes through the ancient halls of power. What happens when the rightful heir to the throne discovers he may not be royal blood at all? The crown jewels can be stolen and recovered. Palace scandals can be weathered and forgotten. But when the legitimacy of the bloodline itself comes into question, even a king must choose between his family and his kingdom. This is the story of how one envelope changed everything, and how the most powerful family in Alderia learned that sometimes the greatest enemy comes from within their own walls. The autumn rain hammered against the tall windows of Whitmore Castle like angry fists demanding entry. King Edmund III stood in his private study, watching the storm rage across the grounds that had been home to his family for 6 centuries. At 62, he still cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair that caught the firelight and eyes the color of winter sky. Tonight, however, those eyes held a weariness that seemed to age him beyond his years. The leather-bound photo album lay open on his mahogany desk, its pages yellowed with time. Edmund's fingers traced the edges of old pictures, his wedding day to Queen Isabella, their honeymoon in the Mediterranean, the joyous announcement of pregnancy that had filled the kingdom with celebration. But it was the hospital photos that drew his attention now. Isabella, exhausted but radiant, holding their newborn son. The tiny prince, red-faced and wrinkled, swaddled in royal blue blankets embroidered with a Whitmore coat of arms. 28 years had passed since that day, and Prince Alexander had grown into everything a crown prince should be. Intelligent, charismatic, devoted to his duties, beloved by the people. Edmund had watched with pride as his son graduated from the Royal Military Academy with highest honors, completed his service tours in the diplomatic corps, and taken on increasing responsibilities within the monarchy. Alexander was ready to be king, had always been ready. The knock on the study door came at precisely 9 o'clock, as Edmund had requested. "Enter," he called, closing the album and placing it carefully in his desk drawer. Prince Alexander stepped into the room, shaking raindrops from his dark coat. Even soaked from the storm, he carried himself with the natural grace that marked him as royalty. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing the strong jawline and piercing blue eyes that had made him a favorite subject of photographers worldwide. At 28, he possessed the perfect blend of his father's commanding presence and his mother's refined features. "You wanted to see me, father?" Alexander asked, settling into the leather chair across from the king's desk. Despite the formal setting, warmth flickered in his eyes, the genuine affection that existed between father and son beyond their roles as king and heir. Edmund studied his son's face, searching for resemblances he had never questioned before tonight. Alexander's eyes were blue, but a different shade than Edmund's own. His nose was straighter, his chin more pointed. These differences had never troubled Edmund before. Children often favored one parent over another, or even grandparents. But now, with the envelope burning like a coal in his desk drawer, every dissimilarity seemed magnified. "How was your visit to the children's hospital today?" Edmund asked, deflecting from the real reason he had summoned his son. Alexander's face brightened with genuine pleasure. "Remarkable, actually. There was a young girl there, maybe 7 years old, fighting leukemia. When I walked in her room, she looked at me and said, You're the prince, but I'm still braver than you because I fight monsters every day." He chuckled, but his expression grew thoughtful. She was right, you know. What courage do I really show, protected as I am by guards and protocol? It was exactly the kind of response that made Edmund proud to call Alexander his son. The young prince never simply went through the motions during royal engagements. He genuinely connected with people, remembered their stories, carried their struggles with him long after the photographers had gone home. "You showed courage when you insisted on serving in Afghanistan despite security concerns," Edmund reminded him. "You could have taken a ceremonial post, but you chose to serve alongside your fellow soldiers. That was duty, not courage. Duty is what's expected of us." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "Father, is everything all right? You seem distant tonight." Edmund felt his chest tighten. How could he explain that the very foundation of their relationship might be built on a lie? How could he voice the suspicion that had been growing like a cancer in his mind ever since DR? Harrison's visit 3 days ago. The elderly royal physician had come to the castle under the pretense of delivering Edmund's routine medical reports. But once they were alone, Dr. Harrison had produced a manila envelope with hands that trembled slightly with age, or perhaps fear. "Your Majesty," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there is something I must tell you. Something I should have revealed years ago, but I was bound by circumstances beyond my control." The envelope contained medical records from 28 years past, DNA test results that had been quietly conducted and then buried. The numbers and genetic markers meant little to Edmund, but Dr. Harrison's pale face and stammered explanation had made their significance devastatingly clear. According to the tests, there was a 99.7% probability that King Edmund III was not the biological father of Prince Alexander. "Father," Alexander's voice brought Edmund back to the present. "You're worrying me." Edmund forced himself to meet his son's concerned gaze. In those blue eyes, he saw the boy who had scraped his knees learning to ride horses in the castle courtyard. The teenager who had struggled with calculus and come to Edmund for help every evening for months. The young man who had called home from military training, homesick and doubting himself, needing his father's encouragement. But he also saw the potential for deception on a scale that could destroy them all. "I received some disturbing information today," Edmund said carefully. "Information that requires investigation." Alexander straightened in his chair, his expression shifting to the alert focus he had learned in military training. "What kind of information? Is there a security threat? Not to our physical safety, no, but potentially to the stability of the crown itself." The words hung in the air between them like a drawn sword. Alexander's training had taught him to read between lines, to understand the weight behind carefully chosen phrases. His father was not speaking of ordinary palace intrigue or political opposition. "What aren't you telling me?" Alexander asked quietly. Edmund stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the storm-lashed gardens. Lightning illuminated the ancient oaks that had witnessed centuries of Whitmore family history, coronations and funerals, celebrations and scandals. But had they ever witnessed anything like this? "Do you remember your mother ever mentioning Dr. Harrison's visits during her pregnancy?" Edmund asked without turning around. The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Alexander took a moment to process it. "I know, not specifically." "Why?" He was very attentive during those months, more attentive than usual, according to the medical records. "Father, what are you suggesting?" Edmund finally turned to face his son, and Alexander was startled by the anguish in the king's expression. This was not the composed monarch he knew, but a man wrestling with a terrible burden. "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Edmund said, "but questions have been raised. Questions that demand answers." Alexander rose from his chair, his military bearing evident in the straight line of his shoulders. "Then, ask the questions, Father. Whatever this is about, we'll face it together." The simple declaration, "we'll face it together," nearly broke Edmund's composure. Here was the son he had raised, the heir he had trained, the young man he loved unconditionally, offering loyalty without even understanding what loyalty might cost him. Dr. Harrison came to see me 3 days ago, Edmund said slowly. He brought medical records from the time of your birth, records that included genetic testing. Understanding dawned in Alexander's eyes like sunrise breaking over a battlefield, gradual, then sudden, then overwhelming. His face went pale, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. What do the tests show? Edmund moved to his desk and withdrew the envelope from the drawer. His hands shook slightly as he held it, this paper document that contained the power to topple kingdoms. They show a statistical impossibility, he said. According to these results, I am not your biological father. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the continuous drumming of rain against glass. Alexander stood perfectly still, his face a mask of royal composure, even as his world shifted beneath his feet. That's impossible, he said finally. Mother would never. Your mother may have had no choice in the matter, Edmund interrupted gently. These tests were conducted without her knowledge, and the results were buried immediately afterward. Someone went to great lengths to hide this information. Alexander sank back in his chair, his composed facade finally cracking. Who? Who would do such a thing? That's what we need to find out. But Alexander, Edmund moved around the desk and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Whatever we discover, you need to understand that it changes nothing about how I feel about you. You are my son in every way that matters. The young prince looked up at his father with eyes that seemed older than they had been minutes before. But if it's true, if the bloodline is broken, then we face that truth when we find it. But first, we must be certain these results are accurate. DNA testing has advanced considerably in the past 28 years. We'll commission new tests, independent verification. Alexander nodded slowly, his analytical mind beginning to process the implications. Who else knows about this? Dr. Harrison, myself, and now you. The original technician who conducted the tests died years ago, supposedly of natural causes, though now I wonder. You think he was killed? I think anyone capable of orchestrating something like this would be capable of covering their tracks thoroughly. Edmund returned to his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 62 years. The question is why? What would someone gain by ensuring that the heir to the throne was not of royal blood? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fireplace where logs crackled and shifted, sending shadows dancing across the walls. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new hardness. Or maybe the question is, what would someone gain by making it appear that the rightful heir was illegitimate? Edmund's eyes sharpened. You think the tests might be falsified? I think that 28 years ago, DNA testing was far less sophisticated than it is today. I think that if someone wanted to create false results, it would have been much easier then than now. But why wait until now to surface this information? Alexander stood and began pacing, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Maybe they didn't intend for it to surface now. Maybe Dr. Harrison's confession wasn't part of the original plan. What do you mean? Think about it, Father. If someone wanted to undermine my legitimacy, would they do it through an elderly royal physician who served our family faithfully for decades? Wouldn't they want maximum public impact? Edmund considered this. You're suggesting that Dr. Harrison found these records rather than being instructed to reveal them. It's possible. Maybe he was cleaning out old files, maybe someone died, and he was settling their affairs. Maybe he stumbled across evidence of something that's haunted him for decades. The idea brought a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that the conspiracy might not be as current and organized as they feared. Dread that if the records were hidden away and forgotten, they might never find the whole truth. There's another possibility, Alexander said quietly, stopping his pacing to face his father directly. The tests could be accurate, but the situation might not be what it appears. Edmund raised an eyebrow. Explain. Suppose Mother was artificially inseminated for medical reasons. Suppose they had to use donor genetic material because of fertility issues you both preferred to keep private. That would explain the DNA results without implying infidelity or conspiracy. The suggestion hit Edmund like a physical blow, not because it was painful, but because it was entirely plausible. He and Isabella had struggled to conceive for 3 years before Alexander's birth. They had consulted specialists, undergone treatments, endured the private agony of failed hope month after month. "We never discussed using donor material," Edmund said slowly. But in those days, medical privacy was different. Doctors sometimes made decisions they believed were in their patients' best interests without full disclosure, especially when the patients were the royal family. Dr. Harrison would have understood the implications of any fertility treatments becoming public knowledge. Alexander's theory offered a path through the darkness that didn't require betrayal or conspiracy, just misguided medical paternalism and outdated attitudes toward patient consent. But it also raised questions that might be equally devastating. "If that's the case," Edmund said, then legally, I have no claim to the throne." Alexander finished the thought without flinching. "The succession laws are clear about bloodline requirements." They stared at each other across the study, father and son united in their understanding of what hung in the balance. Not just their personal relationship, but the stability of the monarchy itself. If Alexander was not Edmund's biological son, then the royal line was broken. The crown would pass to Edmund's younger brother, Prince Marcus, whose own sons would become the new heirs apparent. Marcus, who had never shown interest in royal duty, who lived in voluntary exile in Switzerland with his fourth wife, who had made it clear that he considered the monarchy an antiquated institution ready for the dustbin of history. "We have to know the truth," Alexander said finally. "Whatever it costs us personally, the kingdom deserves certainty about the succession." Edmund felt a surge of pride at his son's words. Even facing the loss of everything he had been born to inherit, Alexander's first thought was for duty and the greater good. If that wasn't proof of his fitness to rule, Edmund didn't know what would be. "Yes," he agreed, "we have to know. But we have to be very careful about how we proceed. If word of this reaches the wrong ears before we have answers, the kingdom could be thrown into chaos," Alexander finished. "Opposition parties would demand immediate investigation. The press would go wild. Foreign governments would question our stability." "Exactly. So we investigate quietly, thoroughly, and quickly. I want new DNA tests from multiple independent laboratories. I want Dr. Harrison's records examined by experts. And I want to know who else might have had access to the original testing." Alexander nodded. "I'll arrange for the new DNA samples to be taken discreetly. We can use the pretext of updating medical records for security purposes." "Good." "And Alexander," Edmund stood and moved to place both hands on his son's shoulders. "Whatever we discover, I want you to remember something. You have been a prince every day of your life, not because of genetics, but because of how you've chosen to live. You've earned the respect you receive. You've proven yourself worthy of the crown through your actions, not your bloodline." For the first time since the conversation began, Alexander's composure cracked completely. His eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I don't know who I am anymore, Father. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my place in the world. You are Prince Alexander of Alderia," Edmund said firmly. "You are my son, the man I raised, the leader I've watched grow into someone worthy of this crown. DNA doesn't change that. But the law serves the kingdom, not the other way around. If we find that ancient genetic requirements would place someone unworthy on the throne while denying it to someone who has proven their worth, then perhaps it's the law that needs to change, not the succession." Alexander wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture that reminded Edmund of the boy he had been, stubborn, proud, but never too proud to accept comfort when he needed it. "How do we even begin investigating something like this?" Alexander asked. "Carefully. Dr. Harrison is the key. He's the one who brought this to light, and he's the one who would know the most about what really happened. We need to speak with him again, this time with specific questions about the circumstances surrounding your birth. And if we don't like the answers we get..." Edmund moved to the window again, watching lightning illuminate the ancient gardens where his ancestors had walked for centuries, planning wars and peace treaties, celebrating victories and mourning defeats. Had any of them ever faced a crisis quite like this one? Then we deal with whatever truth we find, he said, together, as father and son, whatever blood may or may not flow in our veins. Alexander joined him at the window, and they stood side by side in comfortable silence, watching the storm rage outside while a different kind of storm gathered around their lives. Tomorrow would bring investigation and potentially devastating revelations. Tonight, they could still be simply what they had always been, a father and son who loved each other unconditionally. But both of them knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The envelope sat on Edmund's desk like a sleeping serpent, its contents capable of destroying everything they held dear. Yet neither man regretted the decision to pursue the truth. The Crown demanded nothing less than complete honesty, even when that honesty threatened to destroy the very foundation upon which it rested. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, as if nature itself understood the magnitude of what was unfolding within the castle walls. And in the study where kings had made decisions that shaped nations, a father and son prepared to face the greatest challenge their family had ever encountered, the possibility that everything they believed about themselves might be a carefully constructed lie. Dr. Harrison's private clinic sat in the fashionable Mayfair district, tucked between a luxury boutique and an exclusive art gallery. The discreet brass nameplate beside the door gave no hint that behind the elegant Georgian facade lay the medical practice that had served the royal family for 4 decades. King Edmund arrived alone, having dismissed his security detail 2 blocks away, a decision that would have horrified his protection officers had they known. The elderly physician was waiting in his consultation room when Edmund was escorted inside by a nervous receptionist who clearly recognized the monarch despite his attempt at civilian dress. Dr. Harrison looked older than his 78 years, his silver hair thinner than Edmund remembered, his hand shakier as he gestured toward a chair. "Your Majesty," Dr. Harrison began, but Edmund raised a hand to stop him. "Just Edmund today, Doctor. We're here as old friends, nothing more." The physician nodded gratefully, though his eyes remained troubled. "I've been dreading this conversation for days. I should never have burdened you with that information. You did the right thing. Better late than never." Edmund settled into the leather chair, noting how Dr. Harrison's office had changed very little over the decades. The same medical texts lined the shelves, the same certificates hung on the walls, the same subtle scent of antiseptic and leather pervaded the air. "What I need now are details. Everything you can remember about Alexander's birth, and the circumstances surrounding those DNA tests." Dr. Harrison moved to his filing cabinet with careful, deliberate steps. His arthritis was clearly bothering him today, but he unlocked the drawer and withdrew a thick folder with hands that, despite their tremor, held it securely. "I've spent the past 3 days going through everything," he said, returning to his desk. "Medical records, personal notes, even receipts, and appointment logs. The picture that emerges is troubling." "In what way?" The doctor opened the folder and spread several documents across his desk. "Your wife's pregnancy was high risk from the beginning. She had experienced 2 miscarriages before conceiving Alexander, and there were complications early on that required close monitoring." Edmund leaned forward, studying the medical charts covered in Dr. Harrison's precise handwriting. "I remember the concerns about her blood pressure, the bed rest orders. But you assured us everything would be fine." "Medically, yes. The pregnancy itself progressed normally after the initial complications. But there were external pressures that made the situation more complex than I led you to believe at the time." A chill ran down Edmund's spine. "What kind of external pressures?" "Dr. Harrison removed his glasses and cleaned them with shaking hands, clearly stalling for time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I received visits. People who claimed to be concerned about the royal succession, about ensuring the health and legitimacy of the future heir. Who? Give me names. That's just it, Your Majesty. They never provided real names, only credentials that seemed authentic, but could have been fabricated. They presented themselves as representatives of various government departments, health ministry, home office, even intelligence services. Edmund's jaw tightened. The idea that shadowy government figures had been manipulating his family's medical care was both infuriating and terrifying. What do they want? Initially, they said they wanted to ensure comprehensive genetic screening of the fetus. Standard procedure for potential heirs, they claimed, though I had never heard of such requirements before. They provided funding for advanced testing that wouldn't normally have been available. And you agreed to this? Dr. Harrison's face flushed with shame. I was younger then, more susceptible to pressure from authority figures. They convinced me it was in the best interest of the crown, of the country. They had documents, official letterheads, references to protocols I could verify with other government medical personnel. Edmund stood and began pacing the small office, his mind racing through the implications. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception to gain access to genetic information about his heir. But why? What exactly did this testing involve? Blood samples from both you and the Queen, as well as fetal genetic material obtained through amniocentesis. The testing was supposedly to screen for hereditary diseases, genetic abnormalities, anything that might affect the future king's fitness to rule. But the results showed that I wasn't the father. Dr. Harrison nodded miserably. The DNA analysis was conclusive. No possibility of paternal relation between you and the fetus. Yet Isabella had been faithful. I would stake my life on it. I know, Your Majesty. That's what troubled me then, and troubles me now. The Queen was beyond reproach. There was never any possibility of infidelity. Edmund stopped pacing and fixed the doctor with a hard stare. Then, how do you explain the results? I've had 28 years to think about it, and only one explanation makes sense. The samples were tampered with somewhere in the testing process. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. If the samples had been deliberately corrupted, then the entire situation was the result of a carefully planned conspiracy, one that required significant resources and inside knowledge of royal medical procedures. Who had access to the samples? Dr. Harrison consulted his notes. The collection was done here in my office under sterile conditions. The samples were then transported by courier to Gene Tech Laboratories, a private facility that no longer exists. What happened to Gene Tech? It closed abruptly about 6 months after conducting your tests. The facility was sold. The records were supposedly transferred to the National Health Database, but when I tried to verify the chain of custody last week, I found no trace of them. Edmund felt the walls closing in around him. A laboratory that had handled the most sensitive genetic testing in the kingdom's history had simply vanished, taking all evidence of their procedures with them. The courier service? Also defunct. I remember the man who collected the samples. Young, professional, carried all the proper identification. But when I try to trace the company through business registries, it's as if they never existed. Someone created an entire network of fake companies just to handle this testing. Dr. Harrison nodded grimly. That's my conclusion. The level of planning and resources required suggests this was a government operation, possibly intelligence-related. Edmund sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't a simple case of medical error or even blackmail material gathered by political enemies. This was a sophisticated operation designed to plant doubt about the royal succession itself. Who would benefit from such a conspiracy? Anyone who wanted leverage over the royal family. Foreign governments, domestic political groups, even individuals with grudges or ambitions. Imagine the power of being able to prove, or claim to prove, that the heir to the throne was illegitimate. But why wait 28 years to use such information? Dr. Harrison was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small manila envelope. Because I don't think they ever intended for me to reveal it, he said. This arrived at my home 3 days before I came to see you. Edmund opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper with a brief typed message. The truth about Prince Alexander must be revealed. The kingdom deserves to know. You have 72 hours. Blackmail, or a signal that someone else knows about the tests and is forcing the issue. Your Majesty, I believe I was being watched. The day after I received this note, I noticed the same car parked outside my house on 3 separate occasions. My phone has been making strange, clicking sounds. My office security system suffered a mysterious malfunction. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that chilled Edmund to the bone. Someone had been sitting on explosive information about the royal succession for nearly 3 decades, waiting for the right moment to detonate it. And that moment had apparently arrived. Do you still have the original samples? Any physical evidence from the testing? Dr. Harrison shook his head. Everything was sent to Gene Tech. According to protocol, no samples should have been retained after processing. But you're a careful man, Doctor. In a case this sensitive, wouldn't you have kept something back? The physician's eyes flickered with something that might have been hope. There was one thing. It was highly irregular, but given the importance of the case, I took the liberty of preparing backup samples. Edmund leaned forward eagerly. Where are they? Safe deposit box at the Bank of Alderia. I've kept them frozen in specialized storage for 28 years, never quite able to bring myself to destroy them. We need to test those samples, independently, at multiple laboratories, with unbreakable chain of custody. I can arrange that. But, Your Majesty, there's something else you need to know. Something I discovered when I was reviewing the files in preparation for our meeting. Dr. Harrison turned to a different section of his notes, his expression growing even more troubled. What is it? The timing of the original genetic testing was very specific. The amniocentesis was performed during the 18th week of pregnancy, which is standard. But I found records indicating that samples were actually collected on 3 separate occasions. Edmund frowned. Why would multiple samples be necessary? They wouldn't be for standard genetic screening. But if someone wanted to ensure they could manipulate the results, multiple opportunities would provide greater certainty of success. You think they corrupted all 3 samples? I think they corrupted the samples that went to Gene Tech. But I retained material from the second collection, the one I performed personally without notifying the government representatives. Hope flared in Edmund's chest. So the samples you saved might show different results? It's possible. If my theory about tampering is correct, then the backup samples should prove that Prince Alexander is indeed your biological son. And if they don't, Dr. Harrison met his gaze steadily. Then we'll know the truth, whatever it may be. Edmund stood and extended his hand to the elderly physician. Dr. Harrison, I want you to understand something. Whatever those tests show, I will always be grateful that you found the courage to bring this to my attention. The crown cannot afford to rest on lies, no matter how comfortable those lies might be. Thank you, Your Majesty. I'll begin making arrangements for the new testing immediately. One more thing. I want you to increase your personal security. Whoever is behind this conspiracy has already demonstrated their willingness to manipulate events across decades. They won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens their plans. Dr. Harrison nodded grimly. I'll be careful. As Edmund left the medical office, his mind was already working through the next steps in their investigation. The backup samples would provide crucial evidence, but they also needed to identify the people behind the original conspiracy. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to plant doubt about Alexander's legitimacy, and that someone was still out there, still pulling strings. The drive back to Whitmore Castle gave him time to process what he had learned. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Fake companies, corrupted laboratory results, surveillance of royal physicians, and now blackmail to force disclosure. This wasn't the work of amateur blackmailers or opportunistic tabloid journalists. This was professional-level intelligence work. But who had the resources and motivation to target the royal family so specifically? Foreign intelligence services might have such capabilities, but what would they gain from destabilizing the Alderian monarchy? Domestic political groups might have motivation, but few had access to the kind of resources required for such an operation, unless the conspiracy came from within the government itself. The thought made Edmund's blood run cold. If elements within his own government were working to undermine the royal succession, then the threat went far beyond family scandal. This could be an attempted coup, disguised as a genetic revelation. As the castle came into view, Edmund made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He would not limit his investigation to the medical evidence. He would begin a careful inquiry into whom might have had both the means and motive to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. But he would have to be very careful about whom he trusted. If the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government, then anyone could be compromised. Anyone except Alexander, whose loyalty was beyond question, regardless of what DNA tests might reveal. The prince was waiting in the castle's private dining room when Edmund arrived, having requested a late dinner so they could discuss Dr. Harrison's revelations in private. Alexander looked up from his untouched meal as his father entered, and Edmund could see the strain of the past few days in his son's face. "What did he tell you?" Alexander asked without preamble. Edmund poured himself a glass of wine and took the seat across from his son. They were dealing with something much larger and more dangerous than a simple case of medical uncertainty. He related Dr. Harrison's account in detail, watching Alexander's expression grow increasingly grim as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. When he finished, both men sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the implications. "So we're not just questioning my legitimacy," Alexander said finally. "We're uncovering evidence of a sophisticated intelligence operation targeting the royal family. It appears that way. The question is whether this is an ongoing threat or something that's been dormant for decades and only recently activated." Alexander pushed his food around his plate absently. "The timing suggests recent activation. Why now? What's changed that would make someone want to reveal this information after so many years?" "Perhaps they didn't want to reveal it. Perhaps they wanted to continue holding it over us, and something went wrong with their plans. Or perhaps they're preparing for something bigger, and destabilizing the succession is just the first step." Edmund considered this. "You think this might be connected to the upcoming parliamentary session? The constitutional reform debates. It would make sense. If someone wanted to push for a Republican form of government, proof that the royal bloodline was compromised would provide powerful ammunition for their cause. The constitutional reform movement had been gaining momentum in recent years, arguing that modern Algeria no longer needed a hereditary monarchy. The debate had remained civil and democratic, but if Republicans could prove that the current heir was illegitimate, it would strengthen their position enormously. "We need to accelerate our investigation," Edmund said. "If this information becomes public before we can verify its accuracy, the damage to the crown could be irreversible." Alexander nodded. "I've already made arrangements for new DNA testing. 3 different laboratories, all using samples collected under strict security protocols. We should have results within a week." "And Dr. Harrison's backup samples?" "He's arranging for those to be tested as well, using a 4th laboratory. If there are discrepancies between the original results and the new testing, we'll know we're dealing with tampering." Edmund felt a mixture of pride and sadness as he looked at his son. Alexander was handling this crisis with the same calm competence he brought to all his royal duties, even though the outcome might cost him everything he had been born to inherit. "Alexander, I want you to know, Father, stop." Alexander held up a hand. "Whatever you're about to say about my legitimacy or your feelings or how this doesn't change anything between us, I know. I've known from the moment you told me about this that nothing could change what we mean to each other. Then what's troubling you?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, staring into the fireplace where logs burned steadily, filling the room with warmth and flickering shadows. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made him sound older than his 28 years. "I'm wondering what kind of king I could be if I take the throne under these circumstances. Even if the new tests prove I'm your biological son, the mere fact that the question was raised will follow me for the rest of my reign." Edmund understood his son's concern. In the modern age, where every royal action was scrutinized by media and critics, even the perception of illegitimacy could be devastating to a monarch's authority. The strongest kings in history have been those who faced adversity and overcame it, Edmund said. If you emerge from this crisis with your integrity intact, you'll be a more effective ruler because of it. And if I don't emerge with my integrity intact, if the tests confirm the original results, then you'll face that challenge too, with the same honor you've shown your entire life. Alexander, I've watched you grow from a boy into a man who embodies everything I could want in a son and a king. DNA doesn't create character. You did that yourself. For the first time since this crisis began, Alexander smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but genuine. Thank you, Father. I needed to hear that. There's something else you need to hear. Whatever we discover about your parentage, I intend to fight for your right to inherit the throne. If the law says that genetic heritage matters more than character and proven ability, then perhaps it's time to change the law. Alexander's eyes widened. You would challenge the fundamental principles of hereditary monarchy. I would challenge any principle that would place an unworthy candidate on the throne while denying it to someone who has earned the right to rule. The declaration hung in the air between them, radical in its implications. Edmund was essentially saying that he would overturn centuries of royal tradition to ensure that Alexander could inherit the crown, regardless of bloodline. The Parliament would never agree to such a change, Alexander said. They might, if the alternative was chaos. If this conspiracy is designed to destabilize the monarchy, then protecting you protects the institution itself. Alexander stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the castle grounds where moonlight painted the gardens in silver. His father's loyalty was touching, but it also highlighted the magnitude of what they were facing. We need to be prepared for any outcome, he said. If I am illegitimate, someone has to be ready to take the throne. Uncle Marcus isn't fit for the responsibility, and his sons are too young and too removed from royal life. Then we make sure that doesn't happen. Whatever it takes, Alexander. Whatever it takes. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving the night clear and cold. But both men knew that the Real storm was just beginning, and before it was over, it would test everything they believed about family, duty, and the very nature of royal authority. The private laboratory in Geneva operated under such strict security protocols that even its location was classified. Dr. Sarah Chun, the facility's chief geneticist, had been personally recommended by 3 Nobel laureates and had never failed to maintain absolute confidentiality in her work for governments and royal families worldwide. When King Edmund's private secretary had contacted her with a request for emergency genetic analysis, she had cleared her entire schedule without asking questions. Prince Alexander arrived at the laboratory at dawn, traveling under diplomatic cover and accompanied only by a single security officer who waited outside during the sample collection. Dr. Chun herself handled the blood draw, using sealed containers that would remain under constant video surveillance until testing was complete. Your Highness, I want you to understand our procedures, Dr. Chun explained as she prepared the samples for processing. Each sample will be divided into 3 portions and analyzed independently by different teams within our facility. Additionally, identical samples will be sent to laboratories in Stockholm and Toronto for parallel testing. No single point of failure will be possible. Alexander nodded, watching as his blood was carefully labeled and documented. How long before we have results? 72 hours for preliminary results. 1 week for complete analysis with full genetic markers. Given the sensitivity of this case, I'll personally verify every step of the process. And the samples Dr. Harrison provided? Dr. Chun moved to a specialized freezer and withdrew a container marked with official seals. These have been in perfect preservation for 28 years. Remarkable foresight on his part. We'll be able to extract complete genetic profiles from both the fetal material and the parental samples. Alexander stared at the container that held genetic material from before his birth, physical evidence of who he was at the most fundamental level. In 3 days, those frozen cells would either confirm his royal legitimacy or destroy everything he had believed about his identity. Dr. Chun, in your professional opinion, how reliable were DNA tests conducted 28 years ago? The geneticist considered the question carefully. The basic technology was sound, but the processing methods were far less sophisticated than current standards. False results due to contamination, sample degradation, or technical error were more common. However, deliberate falsification would have been quite difficult to detect, meaning that if someone wanted to corrupt the results, they probably could have, if they had access to the samples at any point during collection, transport, or processing, yes. Substituting genetic material or introducing contaminating DNA would have been possible for someone with sufficient knowledge and resources. The confirmation of what Alexander had suspected brought no comfort. If the original tests had been deliberately falsified, then someone had been planning this attack on his legitimacy for his entire life. But if they hadn't been falsified, then he was about to lose everything he had ever known about himself. Doctor, I need to ask you something in absolute confidence. Of course, Your Highness. If these tests prove that I'm not the biological son of King Edmund, what are the implications for royal succession under international law? Dr. Chun removed her gloves and faced him directly, her expression serious. That would depend on the specific constitutional framework of your country. However, in most hereditary monarchies, biological descent from the previous monarch is considered essential for legitimate succession, even if the heir was raised as the legitimate son and has served in that capacity their entire life. Legally, yes. The question of blood relationship is typically considered separate from questions of character or fitness to rule. However, there have been historical precedents for constitutional changes in cases of succession crisis. Alexander absorbed this information with the stoic composure that had become his trademark. Even faced with the possibility of losing his birthright, he maintained the dignity expected of a prince. Thank you for your honesty, Doctor. Please proceed with the testing. As Alexander left the laboratory, his mind was already working through contingency plans. If the tests confirmed his illegitimacy, he would need to consider the welfare of the kingdom above his personal loss. The transition of power would need to be managed carefully to prevent constitutional crisis. But there was another possibility he hadn't shared with his father, the chance that he was indeed illegitimate, but that this fact could be used to serve the kingdom in ways that rigid adherence to bloodline succession could not. The flight back to Alderia gave Alexander time to think through scenarios that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his father. Meeting tonight. Private study. Come alone. When Alexander arrived at Whitmore Castle that evening, he found his father pacing the study with the restless energy of a caged predator. King Edmund looked older than his years, the stress of the situation evident in every line of his face. We have a problem, Edmund said without preamble. Multiple problems, actually. Alexander took his usual chair, noting that his father's desk was covered with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. What kind of problems? The first is that Dr. Harrison has disappeared. Alexander felt ice form in his stomach. Disappeared how? He failed to arrive at his office this morning. His receptionist found the clinic unlocked, his personal effects gone, and no note or explanation. His home shows signs of hasty departure, clothes and valuables removed, but furniture and personal papers left behind. Kidnapping, possibly, or he was warned that his safety was compromised and went into hiding. Edmund moved to the window, gazing out the castle grounds where security patrols moved like shadows between the ancient oaks. Either way, our primary source of information about the original conspiracy has vanished at a very convenient time. You said multiple problems. Edmund returned to his desk and picked up a manila envelope. This arrived by special courier this afternoon. No return address, no postmark that could be traced. Alexander opened the envelope and found a single photograph that made his blood run cold. It showed him leaving the Geneva laboratory that morning, clearly identifiable despite his attempt at civilian dress. Someone had been watching him, documenting his movements, proving that they knew exactly what he was doing. "There's more," Edmund said grimly. "Turn it over." On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message in block letters. "The new tests won't change the truth. 48 hours until the world knows." Alexander set the photograph on the desk carefully, as if it might explode. "They're going to make this public, unless we comply with whatever demands they're preparing to make." This is the classic pattern. Establish leverage through compromising information, then use that leverage to extract concessions. What kind of concessions could they want that would be worth orchestrating a conspiracy of this magnitude? Edmund had been wondering the same thing. Constitutional changes, perhaps. Economic treaties, military agreements, even territorial concessions. If they can prove the heir to the throne is illegitimate, they gain enormous negotiating power. Or maybe they don't want concessions. Maybe they want the monarchy to fall entirely. The possibility hung in the air between them like a death sentence. If Republican forces could prove that the royal bloodline was corrupted, they might be able to force the abolition of the monarchy altogether. "There's another angle we haven't considered," Alexander said slowly. "What if this isn't about external enemies at all? What if it's about internal succession?" Edmund frowned. "You think someone within the royal family is behind this? Think about it logically. Who would benefit most from my being declared illegitimate? Marcus. My brother would become next in line for the throne. And Marcus has always resented royal duty. But his sons..." Understanding dawned in Edmund's eyes. "Richard and James are young, ambitious, and much more interested in royal privileges than responsibilities. If you were removed from succession, they would eventually inherit. Moreover, they've been spending time with some questionable political figures lately. I've heard reports of meetings with wealthy industrialists who have been pushing for constitutional reform." Edmund moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder. "I had intelligence services prepare background reports on various potential threats to royal security. The information about Marcus's family makes interesting reading." He spread several documents across the desk, showing financial records, travel itineraries, and surveillance photos. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Prince Marcus's sons had indeed been meeting regularly with individuals connected to Republican political movements. This suggests a level of coordination that goes beyond simple political opposition, Alexander observed. They're building a network, and if they could prove that you're illegitimate while positioning themselves as the legitimate heirs, they would have everything they need to reshape the monarchy according to their vision, or to abolish it entirely and establish themselves as leaders of a new Republican government. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer, but so was its sophistication. This wasn't the work of amateur plotters. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been in development for decades. "Father, we need to consider the possibility that the genetic testing itself is a trap. What if they want us to pursue new DNA analysis because they know they can corrupt those results as well?" Edmund had been thinking the same thing. "You mean that no matter what laboratories we use, they'll find a way to ensure the results support their narrative?" "It's possible. If they have the resources to create fake companies and corrupt testing from 28 years ago, they might have the capability to manipulate current testing as well. Then, how do we establish the truth?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, his mind working through possibilities. "We don't rely solely on genetic testing. We investigate the conspiracy itself. If we can prove that the original results were falsified, that's as good as proving my legitimacy. But Dr. Harrison is missing, and the companies involved in the original testing no longer exist. Then we find other evidence. Someone planned this operation, funded it, executed it over multiple years. That kind of conspiracy leaves traces, financial records, communications, personnel files. We find those traces and follow them back to their source." Edmund felt a surge of pride at his son's analytical approach. Even under enormous personal pressure, Alexander was thinking strategically about how to protect the kingdom. I'll contact the intelligence services immediately. If this is a threat to national security, no, Alexander interrupted. We can't trust the intelligence services. If this conspiracy reaches into the royal family itself, it might also reach into the government. We need to investigate this privately. Ow! Private investigators, loyal staff members, people we trust absolutely. We build our own intelligence network, limited but secure. Edmund considered this approach. It would take time we might not have. The photograph suggests they're planning to go public within 48 hours. Then, we make sure we're ready when they do. Father, I want to prepare 2 responses, one assuming the genetic evidence supports my legitimacy, and one assuming it doesn't. You would publicly acknowledge illegitimacy? If that's what the evidence shows, yes. But I would frame it in a way that serves the kingdom's interests rather than the conspirators. Edmund stared at his son with a mixture of admiration and horror. You would give up the throne? I would do whatever serves Alderia best. If I'm illegitimate, but the conspiracy was designed to damage the monarchy, then my voluntary abdication might preserve the institution while denying our enemies their victory. And if you are legitimate, but the conspiracy has poisoned public opinion against you, then I fight for the throne, not for personal reasons, but because allowing this kind of manipulation to succeed would set a dangerous precedent for future monarchs. Edmund moved around the desk and placed both hands on his son's shoulders. Alexander, I want you to understand something. Regardless of what any test shows, regardless of what any conspiracy reveals, you're the finest man I have ever known. You would make an extraordinary king, with or without royal blood. For the first time in days, Alexander allowed emotion to show in his face. Thank you, Father. That means more to me than any crown ever could. Then you understand why I will fight for your right to inherit, whatever it takes. I understand. But I also need you to understand that I won't allow my personal situation to damage the monarchy itself. If stepping aside is what's best for Alderia, that's what I'll do. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the study door. Edmund's private secretary entered with obvious reluctance. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but there's been a development. The Prime Minister is requesting an urgent meeting tonight. He says it concerns information that has come to his attention about the royal succession. Edmund and Alexander exchanged glances. If the Prime Minister had been contacted, then the conspiracy was moving into its final phase. What kind of information? Edmund asked. He didn't provide details, Your Majesty, only that it was a matter of utmost sensitivity requiring immediate consultation with the Crown. Schedule the meeting for 9 o'clock. Here in the castle. After the secretary left, father and son sat in heavy silence. The 48-hour deadline mentioned in the photograph was apparently optimistic. Events were accelerating faster than they had anticipated. This is it, Alexander said quietly. Whatever game they've been playing for 28 years, we're about to see the final move. Edmund nodded grimly. Then, we'd better be ready for it. As evening fell over Whitmore Castle, both men prepared for what might be the most important conversation of their lives. The Prime Minister's urgent request suggested that the conspiracy had reached the highest levels of government, which meant that the royal family's private crisis was about to become a matter of public record. But they had one advantage their enemies might not have anticipated. They were prepared to face the truth, whatever it might be, and to act in the best interests of the kingdom regardless of personal cost. The question was whether that would be enough to save the monarchy itself. Outside the castle walls, reporters had begun gathering, suggesting that rumors were already circulating. By morning, the entire world would be watching to see how the House of Whitmore responded to the greatest challenge in its 600-year history. And, in his private study, King Edmund III prepared to defend not just his son's legitimacy, but the very survival of the crown itself. Prime Minister Victoria Lancaster arrived at Whitmore Castle exactly at 9 o'clock, her official motorcade cutting through the growing crowd of reporters who had somehow learned of the late-night meeting. At 55, She carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who had spent her career navigating political crises, but tonight her usual composure seemed strained. King Edmund received her in the formal throne room rather than his private study, a deliberate choice that emphasized the constitutional nature of their meeting. Prince Alexander stood beside his father's chair, his military bearing evident in the straight line of his shoulders and the alert focus of his gaze. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it together. "Your Majesty, Your Highness," the Prime Minister said, offering the customary formal bow before taking her seat at the small conference table that had been arranged before the throne. "I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice." The message suggested urgency. "Prime Minister," Edmund replied. "What matter requires such immediate consultation?" Victoria Lancaster opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope, handling it as if it contained explosives. "In a sense, it did. Your Majesty, this afternoon my office received a package containing documents and photographic evidence that raises serious questions about the royal succession. I felt it was my constitutional duty to bring this matter to your attention immediately." Edmund's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about Prince Alexander's biological parentage, supported by what appeared to be genetic testing records from the time of his birth." The Prime Minister spread several documents across the table, including copies of the DNA test results that Dr. Harrison had shown them days earlier. But there were additional materials, photographs, laboratory reports, and what appear to be sworn statements from individuals claiming knowledge of the conspiracy. "Where did these documents originate?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled. "They were delivered anonymously, but the package included a note stating that copies had been sent to major news outlets, both domestically and internationally. We have perhaps 12 hours before this information becomes public knowledge." Edmund leaned forward to examine the documents more closely. The genetic testing results were indeed copies of those Dr. Harrison had shown them, but the additional materials suggested a much broader conspiracy than they had imagined. "These sworn statements," Edmund said, pointing to several notarized documents. "Who are these people?" "Former employees of Gene Tech Laboratories, the facility that supposedly conducted the original testing. According to these statements, the laboratory was created specifically to handle sensitive genetic analysis for government and royal clients." Alexander studied one of the statements with growing alarm. This technician claims he was ordered to falsify test results, but the falsification was to show that I was illegitimate when in fact I was the king's biological son. The Prime Minister nodded grimly. "According to this testimony, someone paid Gene Tech substantial sums to ensure that the DNA tests would show you to be illegitimate, regardless of the actual genetic evidence. Meaning the real conspiracy wasn't to prove illegitimacy, but to create false evidence of illegitimacy." "That appears to be the case." The technician's statement indicates that the actual test results showed a clear biological relationship between Your Majesty and Prince Alexander, but those results were altered before being reported to Dr. Harrison. Edmund felt a mixture of relief and rage. Relief that Alexander was indeed his biological son. Rage that someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception to make them believe otherwise. Who commissioned this falsification? The technician's statement doesn't name specific individuals, but it does reference payments made through a Swiss bank account controlled by a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Alexander was studying another document with growing concern. "Prime Minister, this forensic analysis of the laboratory records, when was this conducted?" "According to the documentation, it was completed last week by a private investigation firm in London. Someone has been conducting their own investigation of this conspiracy independent of our efforts," Alexander observed. "The question is whether they're trying to help us or manipulate us further." Edmund was thinking along the same lines. The timing was too convenient. Just as they were conducting their own investigation into Alexander's legitimacy, someone else was providing evidence that seemed to resolve the question in their favor. "Prime Minister, what is your assessment of these documents' authenticity?" Victoria Lancaster shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Preliminary review by government experts suggests they are genuine, but the chain of custody is problematic. Anonymous delivery makes it impossible to verify the source or ensure the materials haven't been tampered with. In other words, this could be disinformation designed to make us believe Alexander is legitimate when in fact he isn't. It's possible. Or it could be genuine evidence provided by someone with inside knowledge of the original conspiracy who has chosen to come forward. Alexander stood and began pacing behind his father's chair, his mind working through the implications. There's a third possibility. This could be a deliberate revelation by the conspirators themselves, designed to control how the information comes to light. Explain, Edmund said. Think about it strategically. If someone wanted to destabilize the monarchy, they could either prove illegitimacy or create so much confusion about legitimacy that the royal family loses credibility either way. By releasing contradictory evidence that supposedly proves my legitimacy, they ensure that questions will always remain. The Prime Minister frowned. You think this is intended to help you? I think this is intended to create permanent doubt. Even if these documents prove I'm legitimate, the very fact that the question was raised will follow me for the rest of my reign. Every decision I make, every policy I support, will be viewed through the lens of whether I'm the real prince. Edmund felt a chill of recognition. His son was right. The most effective way to destroy royal authority wasn't to prove illegitimacy, but to create permanent uncertainty about legitimacy. Moreover, Alexander continued, by releasing this information through anonymous channels, they ensure that the source can never be verified or trusted. We'll never know whether we're seeing genuine evidence or sophisticated forgeries. So what do you recommend? The Prime Minister asked. Alexander stopped pacing and faced her directly. We take control of the narrative before it takes control of us. Ow! We conduct our own press conference tomorrow morning. We acknowledge that questions have been raised about my parentage. We present the evidence we've gathered independently, and we commit to full transparency in resolving the matter. Edmund stared at his son with a mixture of admiration and concern. You want to go public before the media forces us to? I want to frame the discussion on our terms rather than letting our enemies dictate how this story is told. The Prime Minister leaned back in her chair, clearly weighing the political implications. Your Highness, going public voluntarily with this information will create a firestorm. Opposition parties will demand immediate parliamentary investigation. Republican movements will cite this as evidence that the monarchy is fundamentally corrupted. And if we wait for the media to break the story, all of those things will happen anyway, but will appear to be responding defensively rather than acting transparently. There's also the constitutional question, the Prime Minister continued. If there's any doubt about your legitimacy, Parliament may feel compelled to address the succession laws before you inherit the throne. Then, let them, Alexander said firmly. If the succession laws need to be modernized to address questions of legitimacy and fitness to rule, perhaps this crisis will provide the opportunity to make those changes. Edmund was beginning to understand his son's strategy. By embracing transparency and inviting constitutional review, Alexander could transform a potential scandal into an opportunity for democratic reform. You would support changing the succession laws? I would support whatever changes serve the kingdom's best interests. If genetic testing becomes standard for royal heirs, so be it. If fitness to rule becomes as important as bloodline in determining succession, I welcome that evaluation. The Prime Minister made notes as Alexander spoke, clearly recognizing the political sophistication of his approach. Your Highness, this would be an unprecedented situation in modern royal history. Good. Perhaps it's time for unprecedented leadership. Edmund felt a surge of pride at his son's words. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Alexander was demonstrating the kind of thoughtful courage that would make him an exceptional king. Prime Minister, I want you to schedule a joint press conference for tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Prince Alexander and I will address these questions directly and announce our plans for resolving them. Your Majesty, I should mention that several members of the royal family have requested meetings tomorrow morning. Prince Marcus and his sons arrived in the country this afternoon. The timing was suspicious, and all three of them recognized it immediately. Marcus had shown no interest in royal duties for years, but suddenly, he was rushing home just as questions about Alexander's legitimacy were about to become public. Did Marcus say what prompted his sudden return? Edmund asked. He cited family concerns and a desire to support the crown during difficult times. Alexander exchanged glances with his father. If Marcus was positioning himself as a potential alternative heir, his arrival suggested that he had advanced knowledge of the crisis. "Prime Minister, I want Marcus and his sons present at tomorrow's press conference," Edmund said. "If we're going to address succession questions, the entire royal family should be united in our response." "Are you certain that's wise, Your Majesty? If Prince Marcus is somehow connected to these revelations, then we'll discover that fact in a very public way. I want no secrets, no behind-the-scenes maneuvering, no opportunity for anyone to claim they were excluded from the process." Alexander nodded approvingly. "Complete transparency serves our interests better than any attempt at damage control." The meeting concluded with agreements on press conference logistics and security arrangements. As the Prime Minister prepared to leave, she turned back to address both men directly. "Your Majesty, Your Highness, I want you to know that regardless of what tomorrow brings, you have conducted yourselves with remarkable dignity under extraordinary pressure. Whatever the outcome, history will remember how you chose to face this crisis." After she left, father and son remained in the throne room, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own challenges and crises. None of them had ever dealt with anything quite like this, but each had found ways to preserve the crown through difficult times. "Are you ready for this?" Edmund asked. "As ready as anyone can be for having their entire identity examined in public," Alexander replied. "But, Father, I want you to know that whatever tomorrow brings, these past few days have shown me something important." "What's that?" "Being your son has nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with the values you taught me, the example you set, and the love you show me every day of my life. No DNA test can change that." Edmund felt tears threaten for the first time since this crisis began. "Alexander, you have been the greatest blessing of my reign. Whatever crown you may or may not inherit, you will always be royalty in my eyes." Outside the castle, the crowd of reporters continued to grow, drawn by rumors of unprecedented developments in the royal family. By morning, the eyes of the world would be focused on Whitmore Castle, waiting to see how an ancient monarchy would handle the most modern of challenges. But inside the throne room, a father and son prepared to face that scrutiny together, united by bonds that no conspiracy could break and no revelation could weaken. Whatever the truth about bloodlines and genetics, they had already proven that the most important qualities of royalty, courage, integrity, and selfless service, could not be inherited, only earned. And tomorrow, they would demonstrate those qualities before the world. The Great Hall of Whitmore Castle had been transformed into a press center overnight, its ancient stone walls now lined with television cameras and broadcasting equipment from around the world. Representatives from every major news organization sat in carefully arranged rows, their collective attention focused on the raised platform, where King Edmund III would soon address the most serious challenge to royal legitimacy in modern history. Prince Alexander stood before his dressing room mirror, adjusting his military uniform for what might be the last time as heir to the throne. The scarlet tunic bearing the insignia of his honorary colonel rank seemed heavier than usual, weighted with the possibility that he might soon surrender the right to wear royal symbols. His reflection showed a man who had aged years in mere days, but whose bearing remained steady and dignified. A knock at the door interrupted his preparations. "Come in," he called, expecting his father or perhaps a staff member with final logistics for the press conference. Instead, Prince Marcus entered the room, looking remarkably well-rested for someone who had allegedly traveled urgently from Switzerland. At 58, Marcus shared Edmund's height and general build, but his face carried the softer lines of someone who had never shouldered serious responsibility. Behind him followed his two sons, Richard, 26, and James, 24, both bearing the entitled expressions of young men who had always expected privilege without earning it. "Hello, Alexander," Marcus said, his tone carrying false warmth. "I thought we should speak privately before this performance begins." Alexander turned from the mirror to face his uncle, noting the calculated casualness of Marcus's expensive civilian clothes, a deliberate contrast to Alexander's military uniform that suggested readiness to assume a less formal style of leadership. "Uncle Marcus." "Richard, James. This is unexpected, is it?" Richard asked, his voice carrying a smugness that immediately put Alexander on guard. "We thought you might appreciate family support during your final hours as heir apparent." The phrasing was deliberately provocative, and Alexander recognized it as such. They weren't here to offer support. They were here to position themselves for what they expected would be his downfall. "I wasn't aware that my status as heir was in question," Alexander replied evenly. Marcus smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Oh, come now, Alexander. We all know what's about to happen. The genetic evidence will prove what some of us have suspected for years. You're not Edmund's biological son. And you know this how? Because, my dear nephew, some of us have been aware of your questionable parentage for quite some time." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Alexander felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with devastating clarity. "You've known about the DNA tests. We've known about much more than that," James said, stepping forward with the aggressive confidence of youth. "We've known about your mother's medical treatments, about the fertility clinic visits, about the donor procedures that were necessary for your conception." Alexander felt his world shift again, but this time toward understanding rather than confusion. The picture they were painting wasn't one of infidelity or conspiracy. It was one of medical necessity, kept secret for royal dignity. "You're saying my mother used donor genetic material?" "We're saying that Isabella's fertility problems required alternative solutions," Marcus replied. "Solutions that Edmund was too proud to acknowledge publicly, and that Isabella was too ashamed to admit even to herself. But that would make the original DNA tests accurate. I'm not Edmund's biological son." "Precisely. Which makes your entire claim to the throne legally invalid." Alexander studied his uncle's face, recognizing the satisfaction Marcus was taking in this revelation. But something didn't add up about the timeline or the motivation. "If you've known this for years, why reveal it now?" Richard and James exchanged glances before Richard answered. "Because it's time for the monarchy to move into the modern era. The old ways of automatic succession based on primogeniture are outdated. Leadership should go to those who are best prepared to modernize the institution." "And you believe that's you?" "We believe that's us," James corrected. "A new generation educated in modern political and economic theory, capable of transforming the monarchy into something relevant for the 21st century." Alexander was beginning to understand the scope of their ambition. This wasn't just about removing him from succession. It was about positioning themselves to reshape the entire nature of the crown. "Does my father know you're here?" "Edmund knows we're in the country," Marcus said. "What he doesn't know is that we've spent the past several years building support for constitutional reform that would modernize the succession process." "Support from whom?" "Parliamentary members who understand that hereditary monarchy needs to evolve or die. Business leaders who want a royal family capable of promoting economic development. International allies who prefer to deal with royals who understand global finance and technology." Alexander recognized the groups Marcus was describing, the same networks that intelligence reports had identified as having suspicious meetings with Marcus's family over the past months. "So this entire crisis was orchestrated by you?" "This crisis was inevitable," Richard said. "We simply ensured that it would unfold in a way that serves the kingdom's best interests rather than covering up inconvenient truths. By manipulating 28-year-old genetic testing, by ensuring that the truth would eventually come to light," Marcus corrected. "The original DNA tests were accurate, Alexander. You're not Edmund's biological son. Everything that follows from that fact is simply constitutional necessity. Alexander moved to the window, gazing out at the assembled crowd of reporters and the growing number of citizens who had gathered outside the castle gates. In a few minutes, he would walk onto that platform and address questions that could destroy the monarchy as they knew it. But his uncle's revelations had actually clarified his thinking rather than complicating it. If he was indeed not Edmund's biological son due to fertility treatments, that was a medical reality rather than a scandal. The question was how to frame that reality in a way that served the kingdom rather than Marcus's ambitions. "Uncle Marcus, I want you to understand something," Alexander said, turning back to face the three men. "Whatever the genetic evidence shows, I will not simply step aside to make room for your political ambitions." "You won't have a choice," James said with youthful arrogance. "Constitutional law is clear about bloodline requirements for succession. Constitutional law can be changed. And I believe the people of Alderia are more interested in effective leadership than genetic purity." "You would challenge 6 centuries of royal tradition?" Marcus asked. "I would challenge any tradition that serves ambition rather than the common good." Richard laughed, but there was nervousness in the sound. "You think the Parliament will support changing fundamental succession laws just to keep you on the throne? I think Parliament will support whatever arrangement best serves the kingdom's interests. And I intend to make sure they understand what those interests are." The conversation was interrupted by a staff member announcing that the